In the remote Colorado Rockies, a reclusive photographer was about to stumble upon a darkness hiding in plain sight for over a decade. What started as a routine wildlife photography session took a shocking turn when she and her intuitive cat discovered a secret wooden door concealed behind a rockfall. Selena Davis wasn't your typical mountain hermit. For nearly a decade, she had been an FBI criminal profiler known for reconstructing the minds of killers. When Shadow led her to that ancient door, she had no idea she was walking into an active serial killer's headquarters, a discovery that would expose crimes spanning multiple states and force her to confront the past she desperately tried to escape. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning light filtered through the pines in slanted beams, catching the frost that still clung to the undergrowth. Selena Davis adjusted her camera lens with practiced precision, tracking the elk herd as they moved through the meadow below. 3 years of mountain solitude had sharpened her eye for the natural world while dulling her interest in the human one. Shadow appeared at her side without warning, the way he always did. His massive Maine Coon frame moved with deliberate silence through the forest floor, green eyes fixed on something beyond the elk. Selena had learned to trust the cat's instincts. He'd shown up at her cabin 2 years ago, half-starved and soaking wet, and from that first day, he'd displayed an intelligence that bordered on unsettling. "What is it?" she whispered, lowering the camera. The cat's ears rotated like radar dishes, tuning into frequencies she couldn't hear. Then he moved, not toward the elk, but away from them, heading up the slope toward the recent rockfall. Selena hesitated. Her routine was photographing wildlife, not exploring geological disturbances. But Shadow paused, looking back at her with an expression that seemed almost reproachful. She followed. The rockfall had happened during last week's storm. Tons of granite and limestone that had reshaped the familiar landscape, creating new shadows and exposing old secrets. As they approached, Selena's photographer's eye catalogued the play of light across the debris, the way morning mist still clung to the crevices between boulders. Then she saw what Shadow had found, a door. Not a cave opening or a forgotten mining shaft, but an actual wooden door set into the mountainside, now partially revealed where the rocks had fallen away. The wood was dark with age, bound with iron hardware that spoke of another century, and it was slightly ajar. Selena's breath caught. Her photographer's instinct wanted to capture the image, the contrast of weathered wood against raw stone, the way shadows pooled in the gap where the door stood open. But something deeper, something she'd spent 3 years trying to suppress, recognized what she was looking at. Underground spaces meant secrets, and secrets in isolated places rarely turned out to be benign. "Just old mining infrastructure," she said aloud, though her voice lacked conviction. Shadow sat perfectly still beside the door, his posture alert rather than curious. Not the behavior of a cat who'd found an interesting smell, the behavior of a sentry who'd detected something significant. Selena approached the door slowly. Her hands trembled as she reached for the iron handle, and she recognized the symptom immediately. 3 years of therapy, of meditation, of losing herself in wildlife photography, and still her body remembered. The physiological response to encountering the unknown, the hypervigilance that had once made her excellent at her job and had ultimately driven her away from it. The door was heavy, solid wood that had somehow survived decades of mountain weather. When she pulled, it swung open with surprising ease, revealing stone steps descending into darkness. The air that emerged carried the scent of deep earth and something else she couldn't quite identify. She should walk away, should close the door and pretend she'd never seen it. Instead, she pulled out her phone and activated the flashlight. The beam illuminated precisely cut stone steps, not the rough-hewn walls of a mining tunnel. Someone had invested serious effort into whatever lay below. The craftsmanship spoke of permanence, of intention. Shadow moved toward the opening, but Selena caught him. "No, we don't go into dark holes." The cat looked at her with those unsettling green eyes. For a moment, she could have sworn she saw disappointment in his expression. But that was anthropomorphizing, projecting human emotions onto an animal because she'd spent too long isolated from actual human contact. Except Shadow had never been an ordinary cat. Selena descended 3 steps, just enough to see that the stairway continued beyond the reach of her phone's light. The walls were smooth stone, not natural but carved. Professional work, recent enough that it hadn't fully succumbed to the mountain's attempts to reclaim it. A memory surfaced unbidden, a case from her FBI days. A basement in rural Virginia where they'd found evidence of crimes that had spanned 2 decades. The careful organization of evil, the way predators created spaces to indulge their darkest impulses away from the world's scrutiny. She backed up the steps quickly, her breathing shallow. On the ground near the threshold, partially hidden by fallen leaves, lay a scrap of bright red fabric. Modern synthetic material, the kind used in outdoor gear. It had been torn, not cut. The edges were ragged, suggesting force, and there were dark stains along one side. Selena's training kicked in automatically. She noted the fabric's position, the way it had caught on the door's iron hinge, the protection from weather that suggested it hadn't been here long. Her mind was already processing scene dynamics, victim behavior, predator patterns. Then she caught herself. She wasn't an FBI profiler anymore. She was a wildlife photographer who'd fled to the mountains specifically to avoid this kind of thinking. She closed the door carefully, noting that the latch clicked into place with well-maintained precision. Whatever this space was, someone had kept it functional. The hardware didn't stick. The hinges didn't squeal. This wasn't a forgotten relic. This was an active location. The walk back to her cabin passed in a blur. Shadow trotted beside her, occasionally glancing back toward the hidden door, as if reminding her of what they'd left unfinished. Selena's photographer's eye automatically catalogued the morning light, the way it played through the pines, the potential compositions. But her mind was elsewhere, running through possibilities she didn't want to consider. At her cabin, she uploaded the morning's elk photos to her computer, adjusting exposure and saturation with mechanical precision. But every image seemed to contain shadows that reminded her of that dark staircase. The red fabric pulsed in her peripheral vision like a warning light. Shadow positioned himself by the window facing the direction of their discovery. His ears remained forward, his posture alert. He'd appointed himself sentry, watching for something Selena couldn't see but increasingly felt she needed to understand. She made coffee, though her hands shook enough to spill grounds across the counter. The familiar routine of her isolation. Photography in the morning, editing in the afternoon, the blessed silence of a life lived without human complication, felt suddenly fragile. The door had cracked something open inside her, and she couldn't seem to close it again. Her phone sat on the counter, silent. She'd kept it mostly for emergencies, rarely used it to contact anyone. The isolation had been intentional, necessary. After what happened in Baltimore, after the raid that went wrong, after the civilians caught in crossfire, after 3 months of investigations and trauma counseling, she'd needed to disappear into a place where her decisions couldn't get anyone killed. But that red fabric spoke a language she understood. It told stories of struggle, of someone who might have needed help. And despite 3 years of convincing herself otherwise, she'd never learned how to walk away from someone who needed help. Night fell early in the mountains, shadows pooling between the pines like spilled ink. Selena lay awake, listening to sounds that had never bothered her before. The settling of logs in the walls, the whisper of wind through branches, the distant call of a nightbird. All of it seemed to echo with the memory of that open door and the darkness that lay beneath. Shadow's green eyes gleamed in the darkness, watching her from his perch by the window. His message was clear, as if he'd spoken. Tomorrow they would return, because some doors, once discovered, demand to be opened, and some questions once asked refuse to remain unanswered. The mountain darkness pressed against her windows, and Selena wondered if the peace she'd built here had ever been real, or if it had always been as fragile as morning mist, waiting for the right wind to blow it away. The mountain darkness pressed against her windows, and Selena wondered if the peace she'd built here had ever been real. Shadow's green eyes gleamed in the darkness, watching her from his perch by the window. By dawn, she'd made her decision. She packed her backpack with proper equipment this time. A high-powered flashlight, not just her phone. Her old Glock 19, retrieved from the locked cabinet where it had sat untouched for 3 years. Extra batteries. A first aid kit. The methodical preparation felt familiar in a way that made her chest tighten. Shadow waited by the door, his tail moving in slow, deliberate sweeps. When she shouldered the pack, he moved immediately toward the trail, not waiting to see if she'd follow. The morning mist still clung to the valleys as they retraced yesterday's route. Selena's photographer's eye noted the quality of light, the way dawn painted the rockfall in shades of amber and gray. But her profiler's mind was already working, constructing scenarios she didn't want to consider. The door looked exactly as she'd left it, closed, undisturbed, the red fabric still caught on the hinge. Selena pulled on latex gloves before touching anything. Old habits. She photographed the fabric from multiple angles before carefully removing it and sealing it in a plastic bag. Evidence preservation. Another habit she'd tried to forget. The door opened as easily as before, well-maintained, recently used. She descended the stone steps slowly, flashlight beam cutting through darkness that seemed to absorb sound. Shadow moved ahead of her, his night vision making him more confident in the blackness. The stairway descended perhaps 20 feet before opening into a larger space. What Selena found there made her stop breathing. The bunker was sophisticated, not a rough hideout or improvised shelter, but a carefully constructed underground facility. The main chamber was roughly 30 feet across, with additional doorways leading to smaller rooms. Solar-powered LED strips ran along the ceiling, activated by a motion sensor as she entered. The sudden illumination revealed the full scope of what she'd discovered. Filing cabinets lined one wall. Metal shelves held surveillance equipment, cameras, recording devices, monitors. A workstation dominated the center of the space, complete with a computer setup that looked expensive and well-maintained. But it was the wall behind the workstation that made Selena's hands shake. Photographs, dozens of them. Women mostly, some men. Candid shots taken from a distance. Close-ups captured with telephoto lenses. People going about their daily lives, unaware they were being documented. Each photograph was labeled with dates, locations, and detailed notes written in precise handwriting. Selena recognized some of the faces. The woman who ran the coffee shop in town, a hiker she'd passed on trails, her own neighbor, Dr. Sarah Kim. Her FBI training took over, overriding the panic that threatened to paralyze her. She photographed everything with her phone, careful not to touch anything beyond what she'd already disturbed. She documented the layout, the equipment, the filing system. Shadow had moved to one of the side rooms. When Selena followed, she found him sitting beside a filing cabinet, his attention fixed on it with laser focus. She opened the top drawer. Missing person files, newspaper clippings, police reports, personal information compiled with disturbing thoroughness. The files went back over a decade, organized chronologically. Some names she recognized from local news. Others were unfamiliar, suggesting a geographic range beyond the immediate area. Each file contained the same elements. Initial surveillance photos, detailed notes on patterns and routines, copies of identification documents, and in some cases, final photographs that made Selena's stomach turn. This wasn't potential. This was historical, active, ongoing. A predator had been operating in her sanctuary for years, and she'd been too focused on her own isolation to notice. She moved through the other rooms methodically. One contained camping equipment and supplies, a bug-out space ready for rapid departure. Another held more personal items, clothing in various sizes, personal effects that had clearly belonged to victims, trophies. The profiler in her mind was already constructing the unsub's profile, organized, patient, methodical, someone with technical skills and resources, someone who could maintain this facility without drawing attention, someone local enough to know the terrain and the community, someone she might know. The thought made her retreat from the bunker faster than she'd intended. She climbed the stone steps with Shadow close behind, emerging into morning sunlight that suddenly felt less warm than it should. She closed the door carefully, then stood in the forest with her hands on her knees, forcing herself to breathe slowly. A memory surfaced. Baltimore, the raid that had gone wrong. Her profile had been accurate, but the timing had been off. They'd moved too soon, and civilians had been in the line of fire when everything went sideways. She'd been right about the predator's psychology, but wrong about the tactical approach. 3 people had died because of decisions she'd contributed to. She'd left the FBI rather than risk making another mistake that could cost lives. But now, standing in the Colorado wilderness with evidence of active predation, she faced a different kind of mistake. Doing nothing. Walking away. Letting this continue because she was too broken to trust herself anymore. Shadow rubbed against her legs, his purr vibrating through the morning silence. The cat had led her here deliberately, had known somehow that this needed to be found. Selena pulled out her phone and stared at it. The local sheriff's number was easy enough to find. One call would set everything in motion, would destroy her anonymity, would pull her back into a world she'd fled, would potentially save lives. Her thumb hovered over the screen. 3 years of carefully constructed isolation balanced against the weight of evidence that demanded action. The mountain silence pressed around her, offering no answers. In one of the bunker's files, she'd seen a recent date. Last week. This wasn't historical. The predator was still active, still hunting. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Still operating in the community where she'd tried to hide from the darkness she'd spent a decade fighting. Shadow sat beside her, patient and expectant. His green eyes reflected the morning light, and Selena wondered again about the strange intelligence that seemed to guide him. He'd brought her here for a reason, had appointed himself her partner in a discovery that couldn't be ignored. She made the call. The sheriff's office receptionist answered on the 3rd ring. Cedar Ridge Sheriff's Department. I need to report a crime scene, Selena said, her voice steadier than she felt. I've discovered evidence of kidnapping and possible murder. Multiple victims. An active underground bunker in the national forest. There was a pause. Ma'am, can I get your name and location? Selena provided the information, watching Shadow as she spoke. The cat's posture remained alert, his attention fixed on the hidden door as if standing guard over evidence that could finally expose the darkness that had been operating beneath the mountain's peaceful surface. Someone will be there within the hour, the receptionist said. Please don't disturb anything else at the scene. I understand. Selena ended the call and sat down on a fallen log, suddenly exhausted. The peace she'd built here was gone, shattered by the discovery of evil hiding in familiar places. But maybe, she thought, watching the morning light filter through the pines, peace built on ignorance had never been real anyway. Shadow moved to sit beside her, his warmth a small comfort against the morning chill. Together, they waited for the authorities to arrive, guardians of a secret that had been buried too long beneath the mountain's indifferent stone. Shadow moved to sit beside her, his warmth a small comfort against the morning chill. Together, they waited for the authorities to arrive, guardians of a secret that had been buried too long beneath the mountain's indifferent stone. 43 minutes later, a white SUV with Sheriff's Department markings appeared on the Forest Service road below. Selena watched as a single figure emerged, tall and moving with the deliberate efficiency of someone who'd spent years learning to assess situations before fully committing to them. Detective Marcus Rivera took in the rockfall, the hidden door, and Selena with the same methodical attention. His dark eyes missed nothing. Her tactical backpack, the way she stood slightly angled to keep both him and the bunker entrance in her field of vision, the latex gloves still on her hands. You're the one who called in the report. Not a question. His voice carried the calm of someone who'd learned not to jump to conclusions. Selena Davis, I discovered the site yesterday. Returned this morning with proper equipment to document what I found. Rivera's gaze sharpened at her phrasing. Proper equipment. Document. the language of someone with training. You went inside? I did. I photographed everything, but I tried to minimize contamination. She paused. You're going to want to call this in to the FBI. What's down there crosses state lines. His expression shifted slightly. Recognition that she understood jurisdictional protocols. Why don't you show me what you found, Ms. Davis? They descended the stone steps together, Shadow leading the way. When the LED strips activated and Rivera saw the bunker's interior, he stopped moving. Selena watched his face, saw the moment his small-town detective mindset had to expand to accommodate what he was seeing. Jesus Christ, he said quietly. He moved through the space the way she had, methodical and careful, photographing, documenting. His hands were steady, but Selena recognized the tension in his shoulders. This wasn't the kind of case that came through Cedar Ridge. This was the kind that made careers or destroyed them. When he reached the wall of photographs, he stood perfectly still for a long moment. I know some of these people. So do I. Selena stayed near the entrance, giving him space to process. The files suggest at least 14 victims over the past 12 years. Maybe more. Rivera turned to look at her. You processed this scene pretty thoroughly for a civilian. There it was. The question she'd known was coming. Selena had prepared several responses during her sleepless night, ranging from vague deflection to outright lies. But standing in this bunker, looking at evidence of crimes that demanded her expertise, she found she didn't have the energy for deception. I was FBI, Behavioral Analysis Unit, Criminal Profiling. The words felt strange after 3 years of silence. I left the bureau and came here for a quieter life. Quieter. Rivera's tone suggested he understood there was more to that story. How long since you've worked a case? 3 years, 2 months, 17 days? The precision surprised her. She hadn't realized she'd been counting. Rivera studied her for a moment, then nodded. I'm going to need your help with this, if you're willing. Selena felt the familiar tightness in her chest, the beginning of panic, of the memories that therapy hadn't quite managed to erase. Baltimore. Gunfire. Civilians caught in crossfire because her profile had been accurate, but the tactical approach had been wrong. I don't work cases anymore, she said. Someone built this facility in my jurisdiction and has been operating for over a decade. Someone local, or at least someone with deep knowledge of the area. Rivera's voice was steady, not pleading, but firm. I've got 2 deputies and a budget that barely covers equipment maintenance. The FBI will send agents, but they won't know this community the way I do. The way you could if you've been here for 3 years. Shadow had positioned himself near one of the filing cabinets again, his attention fixed on it. Selena recognized the cat's alert posture. There was something specific he wanted her to see. She moved to the cabinet and opened the drawer Shadow had indicated. Inside were more recent files, cases from the past 6 months. The most recent entry was dated 4 days ago. A photograph of a young woman in hiking gear. Notes on her patterns, her routines. Where she parked her car. What trails she preferred. The kind of detailed surveillance that preceded action. He's actively hunting, Selena said, her voice tight. This file suggests he's in the selection phase for his next victim. Rivera moved to stand beside her, looking at the file. His jaw tightened. I know her. Claire Morrison. She works at the outdoor gear shop in town. I saw her yesterday morning. The weight of immediacy settled over the bunker. This wasn't just historical evidence. This was an active threat to someone who could still be saved. Selena's hand shook as she photographed the file. 3 years of isolation, of trying to convince herself she could leave this work behind. And here she was again, standing in a predator's lair, holding evidence that lives depended on her willingness to engage. I can't make tactical decisions, she said finally. I won't be part of operational planning, but I can help with the profile, with understanding who we're looking for. Rivera nodded. That's all I'm asking. They spent the next hour securing the scene. Rivera called for backup and forensic support, his radio communications terse and professional. Selena stayed near the entrance, cataloging her observations while trying to manage the anxiety that made her breathing shallow. Shadow remained vigilant, moving between the bunker's rooms as if checking for threats. The cat's behavior had shifted from guide to guardian, and Selena found his presence oddly comforting. At least one creature in her life seemed certain about what needed to be done. When 2 more sheriff's vehicles arrived, along with a forensics van borrowed from the county, Rivera took charge of the scene with quiet authority. He introduced Selena as a consultant without elaborating on her background, and she was grateful for the discretion. But word would spread. In a community this small, secrets didn't stay buried long. Her anonymity was already dissolving, her carefully constructed isolation crumbling like the rockfall that had exposed this bunker. As crime scene techs began their work, Rivera pulled Selena aside. "I need to notify the FBI formally. They'll want to interview you, given your background and your discovery of the scene." "I know the protocols." Selena watched the techs move through the bunker with their equipment, documenting everything she'd already seen. "They'll assign a field office team. Probably Denver, given proximity. You know people there?" "I know people everywhere in the Bureau. Or I used to." She paused. "They'll send Agent Jennifer Walsh. She was my partner before I left. She's the best at coordinating with local law enforcement on serial cases." Rivera studied her expression. "That going to be a problem?" Selena thought about Jennifer. Professional, loyal, concerned. The last person who'd tried to convince her not to leave the Bureau. The friend who'd respected her decision, even while disagreeing with it. "No," she said finally. "Jennifer's good at her job. She'll respect boundaries." Shadow appeared at her feet, winding between her legs in a figure-8 pattern, ready to leave. Ready to return to the cabin where safety and isolation still existed, at least in theory. But Selena knew the truth now. Safety had been an illusion. Evil had been operating beneath the surface of her mountain refuge, and she'd been too focused on her own trauma to notice. The peace she'd built had been constructed on ignorance, and ignorance that allowed predators to hunt. "I'll need to brief you on what I observed," she told Rivera. "Preliminary profile based on the scene characteristics. It should help narrow your suspect pool." "My office. 2 hours." Rivera handed her his card. "And Ms. Davis? Thank you for calling this in. A lot of people would have walked away." Selena thought about the red fabric caught on the door's hinge, about Claire Morrison's file dated 4 days ago, about the victims whose photographs lined the bunker's walls. "I tried walking away once," she said quietly. "It didn't work out the way I'd hoped." She climbed back up the stone steps with Shadow, emerging into afternoon sunlight that felt too bright after the bunker's artificial illumination. The forest looked the same as it had that morning, but everything had changed. The door she'd discovered had opened more than just a physical space. It had cracked open the carefully sealed compartment where she'd stored her identity as an investigator, a profiler, someone who understood the darkness in human nature. And now that door couldn't be closed again. She climbed back up the stone steps with Shadow, emerging into afternoon sunlight that felt too bright after the bunker's artificial illumination. The forest looked the same, but everything had changed. The door she'd discovered had opened more than just a physical space. By the time Selena reached Cedar Ridge's sheriff's office 2 hours later, word had already spread through the community. Small towns had their own communication networks, faster and more efficient than any official channels. Rita Santos stood outside her diner, arms crossed, watching as Selena parked her truck. The older woman's expression was difficult to read, concern mixed with something sharper. Suspicion maybe, or fear. Inside the sheriff's office, Rivera had set up a conference room with the U. Photographs and documentation from the bunker displayed on whiteboards, professional, organized. The methodical approach of someone who understood that chaos in presentation led to chaos in investigation. "Claire Morrison is safe," he said before Selena could ask. "I sent Deputy Harris to make contact. She's staying with family in Denver until we understand the threat level." Selena felt tension she hadn't known she was carrying release slightly. "One potential victim secured." "Good call. Now tell me who we're looking for." She moved to the whiteboard, studying the photographs Rivera had arranged. The organized nature of the bunker, the sophisticated surveillance equipment, the decade-long timeline. Her profiler's mind assembled the pieces automatically, patterns emerging from chaos the way they always had. Male, likely between 35 and 55, long-term local resident with deep community ties. He needs mobility and access, probably owns a vehicle that wouldn't draw attention, work that gives him flexibility and justification for being in various locations. She paused, organizing her thoughts. He's patient, methodical. The surveillance patterns show he studies victims for weeks or months before acting. That level of restraint suggests someone who appears stable and trustworthy in daily life. Rivera was taking notes. Occupation. Something that provides access to people's homes or properties. Handyman, contractor, utility worker. Someone people invite inside without a second thought. Selena studied the equipment photos. He's technically proficient. The security system in that bunker is sophisticated. He knows computers, surveillance technology, possibly has military or law enforcement background. That narrows it down, but not enough. Rivera looked at the victim photographs. You said he's local. How local? Within 20 miles of the bunker. He needs regular access to maintain it, but not so close that his frequent trips to that area would be noticed. She pointed to the surveillance photos. Look at the variety of locations, town center, trailheads, private residences. He moves through this community freely. People know him, trust him. The door opened, and Dr. Sarah Kim entered, her veterinarian's coat still on from her morning clinic. She stopped when she saw the photographs on the whiteboard, her face paling. Marcus called me, she said quietly. Told me what you found. I saw my picture on the bunker wall. Selena studied the other woman's reaction. Genuine shock, fear, but something else underneath. Recognition, maybe. Did you know about the bunker? No, God, no. Sarah moved closer to the board, her hands shaking slightly. But there have been disappearances over the years. People explained them away. Hikers who got lost. People who moved away without saying goodbye. I always wondered if there was a pattern, but I convinced myself I was being paranoid. How long have you been here? Rivera asked. 5 years. I moved from Seattle for a change of pace. Sarah's laugh was bitter. Peaceful mountain living? That's what the real estate agent promised. Before Selena could respond, the door opened again. Tommy Brennan stood in the doorway, his work clothes dusty from whatever job he'd been on. His expression was concerned, helpful, the face of a community member responding to crisis. Marcus, I heard about what happened up on the mountain. Wanted to see if I could help. His eyes moved to the whiteboard, taking in the photographs with what appeared to be shock. Jesus, that's sick. Selena watched him carefully. His body language was open, concerned, his tone genuine. But she'd learned long ago that predators were often the most helpful people in any investigation. They inserted themselves into the process, getting off on the proximity to the hunt. Tommy, this is Selena Davis, Rivera said. She discovered the site. Selena, Tommy does handyman work around the area, knows the terrain better than most. A terrible thing, Tommy said, extending his hand to Selena. You must have been shocked, finding something like that out there. His handshake was firm, his palm slightly calloused. Working hands. His eyes were kind, concerned. Everything about him screamed trustworthy community member. But Selena's instincts were prickling. She'd learned to trust those instincts, even when, especially when, the person in front of her seemed perfectly normal. The bunker was well constructed, she said, watching his reaction. Whoever built it had serious technical skills. Experience with electrical systems, security equipment. Probably ex-military, Tommy suggested. Lots of vets end up in these mountains. Some of them carry their training into civilian life in unhealthy ways. It was a reasonable observation, exactly what someone with no connection to the crimes would say, or exactly what someone trying to deflect suspicion would suggest. I've worked on most of the properties around here, Tommy continued. If you need information about access routes, who owns what land, structural details, I'm happy to help however I can. We'll keep that in mind, Rivera said. Right now, we're still processing the scene. After Tommy left, offering again to help with anything needed, Selena turned to Rivera. He's on your list of people to investigate. Why? Tommy's been here for 15 years. He's helped half the town with home repairs. Fixed my furnace last winter, which gives him access to homes and properties. He knows who lives where, who lives alone, what their security looks like. Selena pulled out her phone, showing him her photos of the bunker's equipment. Whoever set up that electrical system and surveillance network had professional-level expertise. Tommy just volunteered that he knows every property in the area. Sarah spoke up from where she'd been studying the victim photographs. He did work on my clinic when I first moved here. And my house. I gave him keys for the jobs. Rivera's expression shifted. I'll pull records of service calls, compare them to victim timelines. But we can't narrow it down to Tommy just because he's helpful.
I'm not saying it's him.
I'm saying everyone is a suspect until they're not. Selena knew how this sounded. Paranoid, hypervigilant, the same mindset that had made her excellent at profiling and terrible at maintaining normal relationships. Predators hide in plain sight. They're often the most trusted members of their communities. The door opened again, and Mayor Frank Kowalski entered without knocking. His expression was tight, controlled. Political face. Marcus, I need to talk to you about how we're handling this situation. No, Frank, this is an active investigation. An investigation that could destroy this town's reputation. Kowalski's voice was firm. Tourism is our primary revenue source. If word gets out that a serial killer was operating here for a decade, we'll be finished. Selena felt her jaw tighten. There are at least 14 victims. You're worried about tourism? Kowalski's gaze swung to her. And you are. The person who found the evidence, the person whose testimony will be part of the federal investigation. She held his stare. Unless you're suggesting we should cover this up, I'm suggesting we handle it with discretion. Control the narrative before it controls us. Kowalski turned back to Rivera. I want daily briefings on the investigation's progress, and I want approval on any public statements before they're released. After the mayor left, Sarah shook her head. Frank's been pushing development deals for the past year. New resort, expanded hiking trails. This is going to kill those plans. Gives him motive to downplay the investigation, Selena observed. Or to have known about disappearances and ignored them. Rivera rubbed his face. In the span of 3 hours, I've gone from investigating occasional theft and drunk driving to considering that half my town might be complicit in serial murder. Not complicit. Willfully blind, maybe. People don't want to see evil in familiar faces. Selena gathered her notes. I need to get back to my cabin. Shadow needs food, and I need distance from this for a few hours. But as she drove home through the mountain afternoon, she knew distance wouldn't help. The bunker's images were burned into her mind. The victim photographs, Claire Morrison's surveillance file, the sophisticated operation that had gone undetected for over a decade. Shadow sat in the passenger seat, his green eyes watching the road ahead. Alert, vigilant, a reminder that some creatures never stopped sensing danger, even when everything appeared calm on the surface. At her cabin, Selena found a note wedged in her door. Handwritten simple. Welcome back to the work. Some of us never really leave. J. Jennifer Walsh, already in town, already aware of Selena's involvement. The FBI moved quickly when serial cases broke. Selena should have expected it. She crumpled the note and went inside, Shadow following close behind. The cabin felt smaller now, the isolation she'd built less like sanctuary and more like a cage she'd constructed to avoid facing the truth about herself. She was a profiler. It was what she was good at, what she was meant to do. 3 years of running hadn't changed that. The bunker had simply forced her to admit what she'd been trying to deny. Some doors, once opened, changed everything, and the person who walked through them was never quite the same. Some doors, once opened, changed everything, and the person who walked through them was never quite the same. Selena stood at her cabin window, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of amber and shadow, when headlights appeared on her access road. The rental sedan announced federal presence before the driver emerged. Jennifer Walsh looked exactly as Selena remembered. Dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, suit jacket that concealed her service weapon, eyes that missed nothing. Shadow moved to the door before Jennifer knocked, his ears forward in recognition. The cat remembered her from visits years ago, back when Selena's life had included colleagues and partnerships. "You're not going to make me stand out here, are you?" Jennifer's voice carried through the door, familiar, professional, concerned in the way only old partners could be. Selena opened the door. "You could have called first. You would have told me not to come." Jennifer entered, her gaze sweeping the cabin's interior with automatic assessment.
3 years, Selena.
3 years of ignoring every call, every email, and now you're neck-deep in a serial case. "I found evidence. I reported it. That doesn't mean I'm back." Jennifer's expression said she didn't believe that for a second. "I reviewed the photos you took at the scene. The documentation was textbook. You processed that bunker exactly the way I would have. Exactly the way you were trained to. Muscle memory. Bullshit." Jennifer set her briefcase on the kitchen table, pulling out files. "You could have called it in anonymously. Could have walked away and let someone else find it. But you didn't. You stayed. You documented. You're already consulting with local law enforcement." Selena poured coffee, her hands steadier than they'd been that morning. "Rivera needs help. This is bigger than his department can handle. And you need this too, even if you won't admit it." Jennifer's tone softened. "You left because of Baltimore. Because civilians died, and you blamed yourself for the tactical call that wasn't even yours to make. But hiding in the mountains didn't make you stop being a profiler. It just made you isolated and miserable." The words hit harder than Selena wanted to acknowledge. She sat across from Jennifer, shadow jumping onto her lap as if sensing the tension. "The case went wrong because I pushed for immediate action. My profile said the unsub was escalating, that we couldn't wait. I was right about the psychology and wrong about the timing. The tactical team made the entry decision. The unsub chose to use hostages as shields. You provided the profile. That's all." Jennifer leaned forward. 3 people died, and that's terrible. But your isolation hasn't prevented deaths. It's just meant you weren't there to potentially stop them." Selena thought about the bunker. 14 victims over 12 years. How many of those years had she been living within 50 miles, focused on her own trauma while someone hunted? "Tell me about the local detective," Jennifer said, shifting into work mode. "Rivera, you trust him? He's competent, patient, former Denver PD, moved here after his partner was killed. We both came to the mountains for the same reason. A sate or two, running from trauma." Jennifer opened her files, spreading crime scene photos across the table. "Bureau's preliminary analysis confirms your assessment. Organized offender, local knowledge, technical sophistication. We're running the surveillance equipment serial numbers, but this level of setup suggests significant resources. I flagged 3 potential suspects for Rivera. Tommy Brennan, local handyman with access to properties. Mayor Kowalski, who might have ignored disappearances to protect development interests. And Dr. Sarah Kim, my neighbor, who's been here 5 years and claims she suspected a pattern." Jennifer made notes. "You suspect your neighbor?" "I suspect everyone until evidence says otherwise. That's how this works." Selena stroked Shadow's fur, finding comfort in the cat's steady purr. Sarah's reaction seemed genuine, but she has veterinary training, medical knowledge, access to sedatives and equipment that could be useful for abduction and restraint. Fair point. Jennifer pulled out another file. Rivera sent over property records. Tommy Brennan has done work on 70% of residences within 20 miles of the bunker, including the homes of 5 confirmed victims. Selena felt her pulse quicken. That's not coincidental. Also not proof. Handyman in a small community would naturally work on most properties. Jennifer showed her a timeline, but his work dates align with surveillance patterns in 3 cases. He did repairs, had legitimate access, and within 2 months, surveillance photos of those residents appear in the bunker files. Access equals opportunity. He maps their security, their routines, their vulnerabilities, under the guise of professional service. Selena's profiler mind was assembling the pattern. It's perfect cover. No one questions a handyman's van parked at odd hours. No one thinks twice about him being familiar with remote locations. Rivera's bringing him in for questioning tomorrow. Voluntary no arrest. We need you there. Selena started to refuse, then stopped. Claire Morrison was safe because they'd acted quickly. But the bunker suggested the killer was already selecting his next target. Refusing to help because of her own trauma meant potentially letting someone else become a victim. I'll be there. But I need parameters. I consult on psychology and behavior. I don't make tactical decisions. I don't participate in operations.
Agreed.
Jennifer's expression showed relief. The team arrives tomorrow morning. I'll coordinate with Rivera, keep the locals from feeling like we're taking over. But Selena, you need to understand, your presence in this community is going to draw attention. If the unsub is local and you're suddenly working with law enforcement after 3 years of isolation, he's going to notice.
I know.
Selena had been thinking about that since leaving Rivera's office. I'm already exposed. Shadow and I found the bunker. Words spread through town. If the killer has been watching the investigation, he knows I'm involved. Shadow's ears flicked back as if he understood they were discussing danger. The cat had been unusually alert since discovering the door, his behavior suggesting he sensed threats Selena couldn't yet identify. Jennifer gathered her files. I'm staying at the Pine Lodge in town. Rivera set up a command center at his office. Brief tomorrow at 7 a.m. She paused at the door. It's good to see you working again, even if the circumstances are terrible. You're too good at this to waste yourself hiding from your own shadow. After Jennifer left, Selena stood in the gathering darkness of her cabin. The isolation she'd built felt different now, less like sanctuary, and more like a prison she'd constructed to avoid facing the truth about herself. She was a profiler. It was in her blood, in her instincts, in the way she automatically read people and situations. 3 years of wildlife photography hadn't changed that. The bunker had simply forced her to admit what she'd been denying. Shadow jumped onto the windowsill, his green eyes reflecting the last light of sunset. His posture was alert, watchful, a sentinel guarding against threats that moved in darkness. Selena thought about Tommy Brennan's helpful smile, Mayor Kowalski's concern for the town's reputation, Sarah Kim's shocked recognition of her own photo on the bunker wall. One of them might be innocent. One of them might be a killer wearing the mask of a trusted community member. And tomorrow, she would walk back into the world of investigation she'd tried so hard to leave behind. Not because she wanted to, but because 14 victims deserved justice. Because Claire Morrison deserved to stay safe. Because somewhere in this mountain community, a predator was watching, planning, selecting his next target. The mountain darkness pressed against her windows, and Selena wondered if she'd ever really escaped the work, or if she'd just been waiting for the right case to pull her back. The mountain darkness pressed against her windows, and Selena wondered if she'd ever really escaped the work, or if she'd just been waiting for the right case to pull her back. She fell asleep thinking about predators who hid in plain sight, and woke 3 hours later to Shadow's low growl. The cat stood at the bedroom window, his body rigid, ears flat against his skull. Not the posture of a cat disturbed by wildlife. The posture of a creature sensing immediate danger. Selena moved quietly, avoiding the windows, her hand finding the Glock she'd placed on the nightstand. Years of training made her movements automatic. Check sightlines. Assess exits. Listen for sounds that didn't belong. There, a scrape of boot on wood. Someone on her porch. Her heart hammered, but her hands stayed steady. She moved to where she could see the front door without being visible from outside. Shadow had shifted position, now watching the back entrance with the same rigid intensity.
2 people.
Front and back. Coordinated approach. Selena's phone was in the living room, 15 feet away across open space. No way to reach it without exposing herself to whoever was outside. She calculated distances, angles, her chances of making it to cover. The front door handle turned slowly, testing, finding it locked. Then nothing. Silence that felt more threatening than action. Shadow's growl intensified, his attention fixed on the back door. Selena heard it then, the soft scrape of metal on metal. Someone working the lock, not forcing it, picking it with practiced skill. She moved into position, her weapon trained on the back entrance. If they came through that door, they'd face someone who knew how to use deadly force. But her hands were shaking now, memories of Baltimore surfacing. Civilians caught in crossfire. The weight of decisions made in seconds. The lock clicked open. Selena, it's Marcus. Don't shoot. She didn't lower her weapon. Prove it. Shadow led you to the bunker 2 days ago. You found Claire Morrison's file dated 4 days ago. Your former partner, Jennifer Walsh, left you a note yesterday. Rivera's voice was calm, measured. I'm coming in slowly. My weapon is holstered. The door opened carefully. Rivera stood in the doorway, hands visible exactly as he'd described. Behind him, in the darkness, she could see movement. Back up. There was a vehicle parked on the service road 1/2 mile from your cabin, Rivera said. No plates. Driver's seat occupied, but the person took off when my deputy approached. We found surveillance equipment in the tree line. Someone's been watching your place. Selena lowered her weapon, her breathing unsteady. How long? Can't say for certain. The equipment is sophisticated. Wireless cameras with remote access. At least 3 days, based on the mounting hardware's exposure to weather. Jennifer appeared behind Rivera, her expression grim. The unsub knows you're involved. He's monitoring you, probably trying to assess the threat level. Shadow had relaxed slightly but remained vigilant, moving between Selena and the open door, protective, alert. We're moving you to a secure location, Rivera said. Pack essentials. 5 minutes. No. Selena's response was immediate. If he's watching and I disappear, he'll know we're onto him. He'll either rabbit or escalate. You're exposed here, Jennifer countered. Isolated cabin, limited backup response time. If he decides you're too much of a threat, then let him come after me. Selena's voice was steadier than she felt. Put surveillance on my cabin. Use me as bait to draw him out. Rivera shook his head. I'm not using a civilian as bait. I'm not a civilian. I'm a federal agent with a decade of field experience. Selena saw Jennifer's expression shift, recognition that Selena was speaking in present tense, not past. If he's targeting me, we can control the scenario. Set up proper coverage, waiting for him to make a move. Selena, this isn't protocol, Jennifer started. Protocol didn't stop 14 people from dying over 12 years. The words came out harder than Selena intended. He's been operating in my sanctuary while I hid from my own trauma. If I can help end this, I will. The 3 of them stood in the cabin's dim light, the weight of tactical decisions hanging between them. Shadow watched from his position by the window, green eyes reflecting the darkness outside. Finally, Rivera spoke. If we do this, we do it right. Full surveillance team. Safe word protocol. You don't move without checking in. And at the first sign of immediate threat, we extract you whether you agree or not. Acceptable. They spent the next hour setting up proper security. Motion sensors on all approaches. Cameras with encrypted feeds to Rivera's mobile command. Panic buttons disguised as everyday objects. Jennifer stayed, refusing to leave Selena alone even with surveillance active. Tell me about Tommy Brennan's interview, Selena said, making coffee in the pre-dawn darkness. Cooperative. Almost too cooperative. Jennifer pulled up notes on her tablet. Volunteered information about his work history, his knowledge of the area. Expressed appropriate shock and concern about the bunker. No obvious tells, no resistance. Which means he's either innocent or very good at masking. Selena thought about his handshake, his concerned expression. Psychopaths are excellent at mimicking appropriate emotional responses. If he is our unsub, he's had over a decade to perfect his mask. We're pulling his financial records, checking for unexplained purchases that might correspond to the bunker's equipment. Phone records to see if he was in the area when surveillance was placed on your cabin. Jennifer paused. But Selena, if it's not him, then we're back to everyone being a suspect. Selena watched Shadow, who'd taken up position by the front window. The killer knows we found his operational base. He knows I'm involved. His next move depends on his psychology. Is he confident enough to believe he can outlast the investigation? Arrogant enough to think we can't identify him? Or desperate enough to start eliminating threats? You're the threat he'll focus on, Rivera said from his position, monitoring the security feeds. You found the bunker. You have the expertise to build a profile that could narrow the suspect pool. From his perspective, you're the biggest obstacle to his continued operation. Shadow's ears flicked back. His body tensed. Movement, Rivera said quietly, his hand moving to his weapon. Northeast approach, single individual. Selena moved away from the windows, her Glock in hand. Jennifer positioned herself with a clear line of sight to the door. The cabin was silent, except for their controlled breathing and Shadow's low growl. Through the security feed on Rivera's tablet, they watched a figure approach through the trees, moving carefully, avoiding direct approaches. Someone who knew how to move through terrain without leaving obvious signs. The figure stopped 50 yards out, just at the edge of the camera's range. Too far to identify clearly. They stood perfectly still for several minutes, watching the cabin. Then they turned and disappeared back into the forest. "Did you get a clear image?" Selena asked. Rivera shook his head. "Too dark, too much distance. Build suggests male, average height. Could be Tommy, could be anyone." Shadow remained tense, his attention fixed on where the figure had been. The cat's behavior suggested the threat hadn't fully retreated, or that whoever had been watching represented genuine danger that Shadow's instincts recognized. "He's testing," Selena said. "Checking our response time, our security posture, seeing if I'm alone or protected." "Which means he's considering direct action," Jennifer observed. "This has moved beyond surveillance. He's in the assessment phase for targeting you." Dawn broke slowly, painting the mountains in shades of gray and amber. Selena stood at her window, Shadow beside her, watching the forest that had been her refuge become a hunting ground. The predator she'd been tracking had turned his attention toward her, and the game had shifted from investigation to survival. Rivera's radio crackled. "Detective Rivera, we've got a situation in town. Claire Morrison never made it to Denver. Her car was found abandoned on Highway 24, 2 miles from her family's residence. No sign of her, no sign of struggle. But her phone was left on the dashboard, powered off. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. They'd warned Claire. They'd sent her to safety. And somehow the killer had still reached her. He knew our movements," Selena said, her voice tight. "He knew we warned her. He knew where she'd be going." Jennifer's face had gone pale. "Someone with access to our investigation. Someone who knew our protective measures." Shadow's growl intensified, his green eyes fixed on the forest. A reminder that predators moved in darkness, hiding behind familiar faces, waiting for the moment when their prey believed themselves safe. And somewhere in the mountains, Claire Morrison was running out of time. Selena stared at the radio, her mind already racing through scenarios, timelines, victim psychology. Every second mattered now. "He took her between the sheriff's office and Denver," Rivera said, his voice tight. "A 2-hour window. Highway 24 has minimal traffic at night. He could have forced her off the road, simulated a breakdown, any number of approaches." Selena moved to the whiteboard they'd set up in her cabin, writing quickly. "He knew our protective measures. Knew where she'd be going. That means either he overheard our communications or someone told him." Jennifer pulled up her laptop. Everyone at yesterday's briefing knew the plan. Rivera, 2 deputies, Sarah Kim, Tommy Brennan, Mayor Kowalski, plus any support staff who might have overheard. "Tommy was there when we discussed moving Claire to safety," Rivera said. "He offered to check her vehicle before the trip. Said he'd make sure it was running properly." Selena's pen stopped moving. "He had access to her car. Standard community service. Tommy does that kind of thing all the time." But Rivera's expression showed he was reconsidering what had seemed like helpfulness. GPS tracker. He could have placed one while inspecting the vehicle. "Pull his phone records from last night," Selena said. "If he was on Highway 24 during that window, we have our connection." Jennifer was already making calls. The FBI machine moved quickly when agents disappeared, and that's what Claire had become. An abductee in a federal investigation. Shadow moved restlessly between the windows, his agitation increasing. The cat sensed something wrong, some threat that hadn't yet materialized but was building like pressure before a storm. "The profile fits," Selena said, studying the notes she'd compiled. "Tommy's been here 15 years, long enough to establish deep trust. His handyman work gives him legitimate access to homes, properties, security systems. He knows the terrain intimately. And his helpful personality means people don't question his presence anywhere. But he was cooperative during questioning, Jennifer countered. No tells, no defensiveness. Because he's had over a decade to perfect his mask. Psychopaths don't experience anxiety the way we do. He can sit in an interview room, knowing what he's done, and appear completely sincere. Selena's hands tightened on her pen. The surveillance on my cabin, Claire's abduction, he's escalating because we found his bunker. His operational security is compromised, so he's eliminating threats and securing his next victim before we can stop him. Rivera's phone rang. He listened, his expression darkening. Tommy Brennan didn't show up for 2 scheduled jobs this morning. His truck is gone. No one's seen him since yesterday evening. The words landed like physical blows. Their primary suspect had disappeared the same night Claire was taken. He's at the bunker, Selena said with certainty. Or another location we haven't found yet. Somewhere he feels safe, where he can control the environment. We have teams searching every property Tommy's worked on, Jennifer said. Cross-referencing with isolated locations, structures that could function as secondary sites. Selena closed her eyes, thinking like the predator. He wouldn't use a property connected to a client. Too much risk of discovery. He needs somewhere that's his, that he controls completely. Check for land purchases, inherited properties, structures he claimed to demolish, but might have repurposed. Rivera was already on his radio, directing deputies to pull county records. The investigation had shifted from methodical evidence gathering to desperate race against time. Claire Morrison had been missing for 8 hours. Statistics said the first 24 hours were critical. After that, survival rates dropped precipitously. Shadow suddenly bolted for the door, his body rigid with purpose. Not the behavior of a cat fleeing danger, the behavior of one pursuing something. He's tracking something, Selena said, grabbing her jacket. Shadow led me to the original bunker. He's sensing something now. You're not going anywhere without backup, Rivera stated firmly. They moved quickly. Selena, Rivera, Jennifer, and 2 deputies, following Shadow as the cat led them into the forest. The Maine Coon moved with absolute certainty, not wandering, but tracking a specific trail only he could sense. 20 minutes into the woods, Shadow stopped at a clearing. An old fire lookout tower, abandoned for decades, rose above the tree line. The structure looked derelict, but fresh tire tracks in the mud suggested recent activity. That's on Tommy's family property, Rivera said quietly. His grandfather was a forest ranger. The tower was decommissioned 30 years ago. Shadow's low growl confirmed what Selena's instincts were screaming. Tommy was here, and if they were lucky, Claire Morrison was still alive. Rivera coordinated the approach over radio, keeping his voice barely above a whisper. FBI tactical team was 15 minutes out. They should wait, should follow protocol. But a scream cut through the forest silence, female, terrified, coming from inside the tower. Protocol meant waiting. Protocol meant Claire Morrison might die while they established proper perimeter and tactical positioning. Selena met Rivera's eyes and saw her own decision reflected there. Sometimes protocol had to bend to save a life. They moved toward the tower, weapons drawn, Shadow leading the way into the darkness where a predator waited with his prey. They moved toward the tower, weapons drawn, Shadow leading the way into the darkness where a predator waited with his prey. The old structure loomed above them, its wooden frame weathered but intact. Fresh boards covered what had been broken windows, recent repairs that confirmed someone had been maintaining this place. Rivera signaled for the deputies to cover the exits. Jennifer moved to flank the main entrance. Selena followed Shadow, who'd circled to the tower's base, where a newer door had been installed, in what looked like an old equipment access. Another scream. Closer now, Claire's voice breaking with terror and pain. Selena's hands were steady on her weapon, but her mind was racing through Baltimore. The raid, the split-second decisions that had put civilians in danger. She couldn't let that happen again. Shadow's ears flattened against his skull. Warning, the cat sensed immediate threat. The access door burst open, and Tommy Brennan emerged, dragging Claire Morrison by her hair. His other hand held a knife to her throat. The helpful handyman was gone. What remained was something cold and purposeful. "I knew you'd come," Tommy said, his voice calm despite the situation. "You couldn't help yourself, could you?" The famous FBI profiler who ran away from her failures. Selena kept her weapon trained on him, looking for a clear shot that wouldn't risk Claire. "Let her go, Tommy, it's over. The tower is surrounded. There's no way out." "There's always a way out." His eyes were flat, empty of the warmth he'd shown at the sheriff's office. "I've been planning contingencies for years. Did you really think I'd keep everything in one bunker?" Rivera appeared from the other side, his weapon raised. "Put down the knife. Release her. We can end this without anyone else getting hurt." Tommy laughed, the sound devoid of humor. "Without anyone else getting hurt? That's rich. You know how many people I've taken over the years? How many disappeared into these mountains while you all went about your peaceful little lives?" 14, Selena said, keeping her voice level. "We found your records. We know what you've done. But Claire doesn't have to be 15. You let her go, you might survive this. Survive to spend my life in prison?" Tommy's grip tightened on Claire, who whimpered. "I'd rather go out on my terms." He moved quickly, using Claire as a shield while backing toward the tree line. Selena tracked his movement, her finger on the trigger, waiting for an opening that didn't come. He knew exactly how to position his hostage, knew the angles that would prevent a clean shot. Shadow moved like liquid darkness, circling wide through the underbrush. Selena saw the cat's intention a heartbeat before he acted. Tommy didn't see it at all. Shadow launched himself at Tommy's knife hand, 20 pounds of claws and fury, hitting with precision. Tommy screamed, his grip on the knife loosening. Claire twisted away, dropping to the ground. Selena had her shot. "FBI, drop the weapon!" But Tommy was already moving, his free hand pulling a pistol from his waistband. Everything slowed. Selena saw his arm coming up, saw the barrel tracking toward Claire's prone form. She fired twice. Center mass. The shots echoed off the mountains like thunder. Tommy went down, his weapon falling unfired. Shadow leaped clear, landing beside Claire with protective stance. The cat's green eyes were fierce, his body coiled for further threat. Rivera was there instantly, kicking Tommy's weapons away, checking for vitals. "He's down, still breathing." Jennifer moved to Claire, who was sobbing but conscious. No visible injuries beyond bruises and terror. "You're safe. It's over." But Selena couldn't move. She stood with her weapon still raised, her hands shaking now that the immediate threat had passed. She'd fired her weapon, had made the split-second decision to use deadly force. And this time, the outcome had been different than Baltimore. This time the innocent survived. Rivera approached her slowly. "Selena, it's done. You can lower your weapon." She did, her arms suddenly weak. Shadow came to her side, pressing against her legs, grounding her, reminding her she wasn't alone. "Clean shoot," Rivera said quietly. "He was armed, he was threatening a hostage. You saved her life." Selena knew he was right, but her body was still processing the adrenaline. The split-second decision, the weight of pulling that trigger. 3 years of running from this moment, and when it came, her training had taken over. She'd done what needed to be done. EMTs arrived with the FBI tactical team, the forest suddenly alive with personnel and equipment. Claire was taken to an ambulance, going into shock, but physically intact. Tommy was stabilized and loaded for transport to the hospital, where he'd be treated under guard before facing federal charges. Jennifer approached Selena as the scene was being secured. "You did good. Textbook response to an armed hostage situation." "I didn't think. I just reacted." Selena watched the EMTs work on Tommy, ensuring he'd survive to face justice. 3 years of avoiding this, and when it mattered, I fell back on training. That's what training is for. So when you don't have time to think, you do the right thing automatically. Jennifer squeezed her shoulder. "Claire Morrison is alive because you were here, because you came back to the work." Shadow sat at Selena's feet, grooming blood from his claws with systematic precision. The cat had intervened at exactly the right moment, creating the opening that had saved Claire's life. His mysterious intelligence had led them to the bunker, had warned of surveillance, had guided them to this tower. Rivera's radio crackled with updates. Teams had found evidence at the tower confirming it as Tommy's secondary site. A vehicle prepared for quick departure, supplies for extended periods, and photographs of his next intended targets, women he'd been surveilling, planning to take once the investigation died down. He was planning to disappear, Rivera said. Take Claire, wait out the investigation, then resume operations somewhere new. He had cash, fake IDs, everything needed to vanish. But he couldn't resist confronting me first, Selena observed. His ego demanded it. He needed to prove he was smarter, more capable. That's why he revealed himself instead of running when he had the chance. It was a common pattern among organized offenders, the need for recognition eventually overriding self-preservation instincts. Tommy's careful planning had been undone by his own narcissism. As the sun rose higher, painting the mountains in shades of gold, Selena felt something shift inside her. The fear that had driven her into isolation hadn't disappeared. The memories of Baltimore still hurt. But standing here, knowing Claire Morrison would go home to her family, she understood something her therapist had been trying to tell her for 3 years. She couldn't undo the past, couldn't bring back the civilians who died in Baltimore. But she could use her skills to prevent future tragedies, could honor those losses by ensuring others didn't suffer the same fate. Shadow brushed against her legs, purring now that the danger had passed. Her unlikely partner, who'd somehow known she needed to find that bunker, who'd guided her back to the work she'd been meant to do. The mountain refuge she'd built was forever changed. But maybe, she thought, watching Rivera coordinate the scene with quiet competence, that wasn't entirely a bad thing. Sometimes doors opened for reasons we didn't understand. And sometimes, walking through them led exactly where we needed to be. Sometimes doors opened for reasons we didn't understand. And sometimes, walking through them led exactly where we needed to be. The thought stayed with Selena as she sat in Rivera's office 3 days later, reviewing the evidence that had emerged from Tommy Brennan's properties. The scope was worse than they'd imagined. Tommy had survived the shooting and was under guard at the hospital, facing federal charges that would ensure he never walked free again. But the investigation into his decade-long operation had revealed horrors that would haunt Cedar Ridge for years to come. 17 confirmed victims, Jennifer said, spreading files across the conference table. 3 more than the bunker record suggested. He kept some documentation off-site, some purely in his memory. The interviews are providing locations for remains. Selena studied the faces in the photographs. 17 people who'd trusted a helpful handyman, who'd invited him into their homes, given him keys, never suspected that behind his friendly smile lived something predatory and patient. Sarah Kim's been helpful with the investigation, Rivera said. She remembered patterns now that she knows what to look for. Women who came to her clinic for their pets, then disappeared months later. She thought she was being paranoid, but her instincts were right. Instincts usually are, Selena observed. We just convince ourselves to ignore them because we don't want to believe evil exists in familiar faces. Dr. Sarah Kim appeared in the doorway as if summoned. Her expression was tired, the weight of knowledge showing in the lines around her eyes. The memorial service is tomorrow. The families wanted me to ask if you'd be there. Selena hadn't attended a victim memorial service since Baltimore. The families there had looked at her with accusation in their eyes, blame for the tactical decisions that had put their loved ones in danger. She'd avoided those gatherings for 3 years, unable to face the weight of their grief. I'll be there, she said quietly. Sarah sat down, Shadow immediately jumping onto her lap. The cat had taken to the veterinarian, perhaps sensing her genuine nature. I keep thinking about how many times Tommy did work on my clinic. How many times I was alone with him, vulnerable. He could have, but he didn't, Rivera interrupted gently. You weren't his type. His victims followed specific patterns. Young women, transient or socially isolated. People whose disappearance wouldn't immediately trigger extensive searches. Cold comfort, Sarah said, but she stroked Shadow's fur, finding solace in the cat's steady purr. The whole town is reeling. Everyone keeps asking how we didn't see it. How he operated for so long without anyone noticing. Because he was good at hiding. Selena said. Predators like Tommy don't look like monsters. They look like helpful neighbors. They integrate into communities, build trust, exploit that trust methodically. That's what makes them so dangerous. Jennifer pulled up a timeline on her laptop. His pattern was consistent. He'd do legitimate work on a property, establish rapport, identify isolated individuals. Then months later, when the connection wasn't fresh in anyone's mind, he'd make his move. The gap between contact and abduction made it nearly impossible to draw connections. Until someone found his operational base, Rivera added, nodding toward Selena. Without that bunker, we might never have connected the cases. He'd still be operating. Shadow jumped from Sarah's lap to Selena's, his green eyes fixing on her with that unsettling intelligence. The cat had known, had sensed something wrong, and led her to discover what needed to be found. Selena still didn't understand how, but she'd stopped questioning Shadow's instincts. The town council wants to hold a recognition ceremony, Sarah said. For you, for finding the evidence. Maya Kowalski is pushing for it. Says the community needs positive closure. Selena's jaw tightened. Kowalski spent the first days of this investigation worrying about tourism and development deals. Now he wants to turn this into a photo opportunity. Frank's not a bad person, Rivera said diplomatically. He's just a politician who thinks in terms of public perception. But Sarah's right. The community needs some kind of closure, some way to process what happened. The memorial service was held at the community center, a building Tommy Brennan had helped renovate 5 years earlier. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. 17 families gathered to remember loved ones who'd been stolen by someone they'd trusted. Selena stood at the back, uncomfortable with the attention but unwilling to hide. Jennifer stood beside her, professional support for a partner who was still learning to be present for grief instead of running from it. Mayor Kowalski spoke about community resilience. Rita Santos shared memories of victims who'd eaten at her diner, whose laughter she'd never hear again. Sarah Kim talked about the pets left behind, animals who'd waited for owners who would never return. When it was Selena's turn to speak, she moved to the podium with Shadow at her side. The cat had insisted on coming, had positioned himself as her anchor. I didn't know any of the victims, she began, her voice steady despite her nerves. I came to these mountains 3 years ago to escape my own failures, to hide from work I thought I couldn't do anymore. But someone needed to find that bunker. Someone needed to expose what was happening in the shadows. She looked at the faces in the crowd, grief, anger, but also something that might have been gratitude. I can't bring back the people you lost, can't undo the years Tommy Brennan operated in this community. But I can promise that their deaths mattered, that the evidence we gathered will ensure justice, that other communities will be warned about predators who hide behind helpful smiles. Shadow's purr was audible in the silent room, grounding, reminding her she wasn't alone. 3 years ago, I made mistakes that cost lives. I ran from that responsibility, convinced I couldn't trust my judgment anymore. But isolation doesn't heal trauma. It just postpones dealing with it. She paused, gathering her thoughts. Your loved ones deserve someone who would keep looking for patterns, who would question assumptions, who would refuse to accept that disappearances were just tragic accidents. I wish I'd been that person sooner. I wish I'd seen what was happening instead of being too focused on my own pain. Rivera had moved to stand near the front, his expression supportive. Jennifer's eyes reflected understanding that only a partner could have. And Shadow remained at her feet, green eyes watchful, protective. The door I found behind that rockfall opened more than just a physical space. It opened a path I'd been avoiding. Back to work that matters. Back to using skills that can prevent tragedies. Back to accepting that perfection isn't the goal. Being present and trying is. She looked at the photographs of the 17 victims displayed around the room. I see you. I'll remember you. And I promise that the work continues. That predators hiding in plain sight will be exposed. That other families won't suffer what you've suffered if I can prevent it. The ceremony ended with silence rather than applause. Grief didn't allow for celebration. But several families approached Selena afterward, thanking her quietly. Acknowledging that closure, even painful closure, was better than endless wondering. "You did good today," Rivera said as the crowd dispersed. "Facing these people instead of hiding. That took courage." "Or stupidity," Selena replied, but without real conviction. "I'm not used to being visible. 3 years of isolation made me forget how to be part of something larger than myself." "You're remembering," Jennifer observed. "That's what matters." That evening, Selena returned to her cabin with Shadow, the space feeling different than it had a week ago. The isolation that had once felt like safety now felt limiting. The mountains were still beautiful, still peaceful, but she understood now that peace couldn't be built on ignorance or avoidance. Her phone rang. Rivera's name on the screen. "Another case," he said without preamble. "Missing person 2 counties over. Local sheriff heard about our work here, asked if you'd consult. Woman disappeared from a hiking trail 3 days ago. No witnesses, no evidence. Could be accident, could be something else." Selena looked at Shadow, who watched her with those knowing green eyes. The cat seemed to understand the choice she was making, moving forward instead of backward, engaging instead of hiding. "Send me the details," she said. "I'll review the case file tonight." After ending the call, she sat by the window watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of amber and shadow. The door she'd discovered had changed everything, had forced her to confront truths about herself she'd been avoiding. That she was a profiler. That isolation hadn't healed her trauma, only postponed dealing with it. That her skills could save lives if she was willing to use them. Shadow jumped onto her lap, his purr vibrating through her chest. Her mysterious companion who'd led her to that bunker, who'd guided her back to work that mattered. She still didn't understand the cat's uncanny instincts, but she'd learned to trust them. The mountain darkness gathered outside, but inside, Selena felt something that had been absent for 3 years. Purpose, connection. The understanding that running from the past didn't heal it, facing it did. Tomorrow would bring new cases, new challenges, new opportunities to use her skills for good. But tonight, she sat with her cat and watched the mountains, accepting that sometimes the doors we discover lead exactly where we need to go, even when we don't realize we've been lost. The mountain darkness gathered outside, but inside, Selena felt something that had been absent for 3 years. Purpose, connection. The understanding that running from the past didn't heal it, facing it did. 6 months had passed since that understanding took root. Selena's cabin looked different now. A second desk held case files from 3 counties. A whiteboard covered one wall, currently displaying notes on a missing hiker case from Wyoming. Her photography equipment still occupied its corner, but it shared space with investigative tools she'd stopped pretending she didn't need. Shadow dozed on the windowsill, his massive form silhouetted against morning light. The cat had settled into their new routine with the same mysterious acceptance he showed for everything. Consulting work meant irregular hours, occasional travel, but Shadow adapted. Always watching, always alert. Rivera's truck appeared on the access road right on schedule. Their weekly briefing had become ritual. Coffee, case review, the comfortable partnership of 2 people who'd found their way back to work that mattered. "Tommy Brennan pleaded guilty," Rivera said, accepting the mug Selena offered. "All 17 counts. Federal prosecutor said he wanted to avoid trial, spare the families from testimony. Sentencing is next month. Life without parole on multiple counts," Selena said. It wasn't a question. The evidence had been overwhelming. "Judge will probably recommend psychiatric evaluation. Defense is arguing diminished capacity." Rivera's expression showed what he thought of that strategy. "But the prosecutors have your profile. The evidence of planning, sophistication, years of methodical operation. No jury would buy insanity." Selena thought about Tommy in that tower, his cold eyes and calculated movements. Not insane, just empty of empathy, driven by impulses most people learned to control in childhood. "How's the community doing?" "Healing, slowly." Rivera studied the caseboard on her wall. "Rita's Diner has become unofficial therapy central. People gather there, talk about what happened, try to make sense of it. Sarah's been organizing support groups for families." "And you?" Rivera met her eyes. "Better, having purpose helps. Knowing we stopped him, that he can't hurt anyone else." He paused. Having a partner who understands the work helps too. The word partner hung between them, carrying weight beyond professional collaboration. Over 6 months, their relationship had evolved. Respect had become trust. Trust had become something deeper neither of them had quite named yet. Shadow stretched, jumping down to wind between their legs. The cat's approval was subtle but clear. "New case came in this morning," Rivera said, pulling out a file. "Disappearance in Montana. Woman vanished from a campground. Local sheriff noticed similarities to our case. Organized offender, isolated location, victim who fit a pattern." Selena opened the file, her profiler's mind already working. Surveillance photos in the days before disappearance. Equipment suggesting technical sophistication. He's using Tommy's methodology. Or he's Tommy's protégé. The FBI is investigating whether Tommy had contact with other offenders, whether he shared techniques. Rivera pointed to timeline details. "They want you to review the case, see if the behavioral signature matches." Jennifer Walsh had called the previous week with similar requests. Selena's work on the Brennan case had attracted attention within the Bureau. Consulting offers, even an invitation to return to Quantico in an advisory role. She'd declined the full-time position. The mountains were still her home, isolation still necessary in measured doses. But consulting let her use her skills without surrendering the peace she'd fought to rebuild. "I'll review it," Selena said. "But Rivera, I need you to understand something. I'm not the agent I was 3 years ago. I can't be in the field constantly, can't handle the pressure of full-time operational work. This balance, consulting, having space to breathe, it's what I can manage." "I know." His expression was understanding. "You've been clear about boundaries. I respect them. The Bureau respects them. You work cases on your terms or you don't work them at all." Shadow jumped onto the desk, pawing at the Montana file. His interest was focused, deliberate, the same attention he'd shown before leading Selena to Tommy's bunker. "Shadow thinks this case is important," Selena observed. "Shadow has better instincts than most agents I've worked with." Rivera scratched the cat behind the ears, earning a rumbling purr. "If he's interested, we should probably pay attention." Later, after Rivera left, Selena stood on her porch watching the mountains. The same view she'd fled to 3 years ago seeking escape. But now she saw it differently. Not as hiding place, but as home base. The foundation from which she could do work that mattered while maintaining the healing she'd fought for. Her phone buzzed. Jennifer, checking in as she did most weeks. Brief messages confirming Selena was okay, offering support without pressure. "Reviewed the Montana case," Selena typed. "Behavioral signature is similar but not identical. Different cooling-off period, different victim selection. Not Tommy's work, but someone studying the same patterns. We'll send full analysis tonight." The work continued. It always would. Predators existed, hiding behind familiar faces, and people with skills to identify them had responsibility to try. But Selena had learned the difference between responsibility and self-destruction, between using her skills and losing herself in them. The door she'd discovered behind that rockfall had led back to her calling, but on terms she could sustain. Shadow appeared at her side, his green eyes reflecting afternoon light. Her mysterious companion who'd known she needed to find that bunker, who'd guided her back to work that honored both her capabilities and her limitations. "Ready for a walk?" she asked the cat. Shadow's tail swished in agreement. They headed into the forest together, the same trails where this journey had begun 6 months earlier. But everything had changed. Selena was no longer running from her past. She was integrating it, using hard-won wisdom to prevent future tragedies while respecting her own boundaries. The mountains held their secrets still. But Selena had learned that some secrets demanded exposure, some doors demanded opening. And sometimes the path forward meant accepting all parts of yourself. The broken pieces and the strong ones, the failures and the victories, the need for isolation and the call to connection. Shadow led the way through the pines, and Selena followed, no longer afraid of where the journey might lead. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.